For the better part of the last 15 months, since October of 2023, every time we talk about the Middle East, it's always about what Israel's doing and what's happening in maybe the Red Sea with Yemen, or in Hezbollah with the southern Lebanon, or Gaza Strip, of course. But now all of a sudden, the Middle East has a new fire going on, and that is in Syria. After basically Syria has been in a low level, almost suspended animation civil war since 2011. It kind of settled in from 2016 to 2020 and had been kind of on the back burner, even in the region, for a long time. And it was never resolved, but it had kind of settled into not open warfare. Well, that came to a rather abrupt end about a week ago when a rebel group that many in the West hadn't even heard of, HTS is what they're called, all of a sudden starts moving on the town of Aleppo. And the Syrian army basically just collapsed and almost let them walk in without having any resistance. Now then, since that time, there was lots of reports at that time that Russia and the Syrian Air Force were going to start using aerial bombardment. And the expectation is, all right, well, that's going to slow things down. But it hasn't so far. And in fact, now they seem to be picking up speed, moving towards Damascus. Now, to try to unpack what in the world is going on here, we have a great expert we've had on the show before, Rajan Menon, who is currently the professor emeritus at City College of New York and a fellow at Defense Priorities, where I work as well. Raj, wow, welcome back to the show, first of all, but holy cow, what in the world's going on in Syria?
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, head-spinning details, but let's see if we can sort them out.
So actually, kind of to set the stage, I want to show that this little kind of an animated map thing that kind of shows people kind of where things started and where they're heading right now. This was earlier today.
Now, led by a Sunni Islamist group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the opposition is taking territory yet again. They claim to have control of Idlib province. They've also taken Aleppo in just 3 days, including the city's airport. And they posted pictures of themselves in the city centre, while the government retaliated with airstrikes, including a strike on the university hospital. They've taken control of Hama, too, in the centre of the country after the Syrian Arab army withdrew, and they're expected now to target the city of Homs.
And Gary, if you can throw that map back up there. Raj, first of all, who is HTS, and where in the world did they come from, and how did they suddenly, out of seemingly nowhere, form a field army that can drive from city to city?
Right. Let me see if I can do this quickly, Danny. HTS stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Organization for the Liberation of Levant. It began in 2011 as a group called Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra came about because in 2011, ISIS elements crossed into eastern Syria from Iraq, and Jabhat al-Nusra became essentially an ISIS affiliate. Now, the head of Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, who is also the current head of HTS, a man named Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, wanted to run his own show. So he broke with ISIS and linked up with al-Qaeda. But al-Qaeda also wanted him to be under its direction, and he broke with al-Qaeda. Since then, having formed HTS in about 2016, he has tried to package himself as not a transnational jihadist, but a Syrian Islamist whose agenda is limited to Syria. And he has tried to show over and over again, especially most recently, that he will be completely tolerant of the religious rights and freedoms of religious and ethnic minorities, including Christians, Armenians, Druze, Assyrians, and other people. So he has tried to reinvent himself. And so that is what HTS is in a nutshell.
And by the way, just so people know, we're having some audio challenges on Raj's mic that we're trying to work through, but this is so important. We're going to try and push through it anyway. You speaking of Jelani, I want to show folks kind of what he's saying, because in terms of what is their objective, he was in a CNN interview pretty clear about what he's trying to do.
The seeds of the regime's defeat have always been within it. It has been effectively dead since that time. However, the Iranians attempted to revive the regime, buying it time, and later the Russians also tried to prop it up. But the truth remains, this regime is dead.
So pretty straightforward. He's looking for regime change to try and I guess just take over entirely Syria. Do you think that they have the capacity to make good on that threat?
Right. So far, Danny, they've been ensconced in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. They have now taken over the city of Aleppo, which is a city of 2.9 million, second largest city in Syria. They have now moved toward two southern provinces further south, Hama as well as Homs. So they are on the road to Damascus, and the Syrian army has pulled back. But it's even worse than this because, in addition to pulling back from Hama and Homs, they have now reportedly pulled out of the southwestern province of Dara, which is near the Jordanian border, and the eastern province of Deir ez-Zor. So they are in retreat. Now, the charitable interpretation is that they're regrouping, pulling their forces back, trying to stretch out the supply lines of the rebels and mustering forces so they can defend Damascus. The not so charitable interpretation from their standpoint is that they're on the run. So time will tell, but it's not looking good for the Assad regime. I'm not saying it's about to collapse, but it is certainly being forced to withdraw.
Now, in terms of the Syrian army, there was this report on Sky News earlier today saying that there is growing evidence that actually Syria's army does look like a paper tiger.
The Syrian army just withdrew from Aleppo about a week ago, almost a week ago, and it did the same in Hama yesterday. Now, the official reason for their withdrawal from Hama without putting up a fight was to avoid civilian casualties and to avoid what would have probably been a major urban battle in the center of Hama. So that's the official reason. Not a lot of people are buying that. It is looking increasingly likely that the Syrian government army, the Syrian government military, is something of a paper tiger.
So that could have significant ramifications. And one would just wonder, after all of this time and all the time that the Syrian regime has been fighting, and especially after they took Aleppo, I think it took like 4 years or something to finally do, but they finally quelled the rebels or the Islamic groups that were fighting in there. Then in came the Russians to actually help them as well. How could they now then have devolved into a paper tiger where they're getting routed without really even fighting for Aleppo?
It is really surprising. So here's one perspective, right? Assad's eye was not on the ball, and that is because he thought that because of Iranian help on the ground and Russian help on the ground starting in 2015, he had essentially won the war. And he did control, until quite recently, between 2/3 and 70% of Syria. On top of that, he had begun normalizing relations with the key Arab regimes, the Gulf monarchies, including Saudi Arabia and others. The Arab League had been welcoming him into his fold, and he seemed to have reached some kind of an agreement, even with the Israelis to this extent. During the Israeli war with Hezbollah and Hamas, the Syrian front has been kept completely quiet. So Assad, I think, had reason to believe that time was on his side. Now, that doesn't, however, explain how rapidly the Syrian military has collapsed. That is a surprise, I think, to the rebels, not just to Assad and outside the observers.
And do you know if the opposition HTS do they have the military capacity to wage a campaign and to continue to drive down? Do they have the wherewithal to do that?
Right. So in 2020, the Turks and the Russians brokered a ceasefire between the Assad regime and HTS in Idlib province in the northwest, where HTS was ensconced. Now, what HTS did is use that time to increase their numbers and increase their firepower. So they are now much stronger, right? So what we need to see is as they move south, having taken Aleppo and marching through, it appears, Hama and Homs, whether their supply lines get stretched out and they are vulnerable to a Syrian counterattack. The Syrians are pulling toward Damascus, as I said, but also withdrawing from provinces in the east, the province of Deir ez-Zor and Dar from the south. What we cannot know, Danny, is whether this is a tactical withdrawal, right, to stretch out the supply lines of the insurgents, or whether this is just a rout. I cannot tell you based on what I'm seeing now, and even commentators who look at this very closely are not entirely clear what's going on.
Yeah, from a military perspective, I would tend toward the view that they are trying to fight from ground that's more beneficial to themselves, because when the ISIS had a similar situation in Mosul in 2014, and the Iraqi army, the ISW, that are the Iraqi security forces that we had helped train all this time, and then allegedly were good to go. They literally melted away. I mean, I'm talking like throwing their weapons away, taking their uniforms off, and running, and left the city, etc. And they were in a full-scale rout. At least so far from the reports, the Syrian army is withdrawing in order, and they haven't, given their stuff away or ran away. And there haven't been any real heavy clashes. So they appear to be holding on to their power. So again, as you say, it's too early to tell whether they're afraid to fight or whether they're just trying to draw the HTS into a trap, so to speak, by stretching them out and then hitting them when their supply lines are weak.
Just very quickly, you make a very good point. So far, we don't have any evidence of mass abandonment of equipment and helter-skelter fleeing or mass defections. So that would lead us to believe that maybe this is an organized withdrawal. But no matter how you slice it, right? The fact that HTS, and another group, by the way, supported by Turkey called the Syrian National Army, suddenly was able to pull this off and take so much ground is absolutely astounding.
Well, it is. And because even if that may be what the Syrians are trying to do, that means that they have now given up two major cities that would ostensibly have to be physically retaken at very high cost again later. So whatever they're doing, it's not good for the Syrian side. I want to talk about something you mentioned at the outset here about the fact that this organization HTS came from an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and they had some issue back and forth with ISIS or whatever. I think they actually fight along with them. And then the question is, who are they really? Now, I want to show you, first of all, in that same CNN interview with Jelani, he was asked that question, and here's how he's presenting himself.
You've gone through quite the transformation. Once an Al-Qaeda leader, your group has had affiliations with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and now you are projecting this image of a moderate leader and a moderate group. What is HTS right now?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is one of the factions in the region, just like all the others. Now we're talking about a larger project. We're talking about building Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is merely one detail of this dialogue, and it may dissolve at any time. It's not an end in itself, but a means to perform a task confronting this regime. Once that task is complete, it will transition to a state of governance, institutions, and so on.
And as you mentioned earlier, he also said, we are going to respect the rights of minorities. We're going to, the Christians, the Druze, the Jews, whatever are in there, that they don't have anything to worry about. We're going to put in this new system of governance, and making it sound like that they're this opposite, basically a rebel group that wants to liberate Syria and have a better country. But in the 2020 presidential primary for the Democratic side, then Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard said, yeah, hang on about calling these folks rebels, because it's in their DNA to be something else. Here's how she put it.
The biggest and most powerful al-Qaeda enclave in the world today is in Idlib, Syria. Brett McGurk, the former U.S. Special Envoy for the war against ISIS, who served under both the Obama and Trump administrations, described Idlib province is the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11. Operation Inherent Resolve's Colonel Miles Kagan said, Idlib province seems to be a magnet for terrorist groups, especially because it is an ungoverned space in many ways, and there are a variety of groups there, All of them are a nuisance, a menace, and a threat to the civilians, the hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who are just trying to make it through the winter and searching for the hope and will to live and survive. Yet our corporate media refers to these al-Qaeda terrorists as rebels and wants to protect them.
Now, I know one man's rebel is another man's terrorist, et cetera, so it depends on where you sit on the table. But to what extent do you think that they have indeed changed their spots? Because he was al-Qaeda, he was at some point affiliated with some ISIS, and then has over some number of years broken from that. So there is some evidence that maybe he did break. But how much do you think that they are different now? Can they be considered a nationalist liberation group, or are they still a terrorist that we need to be worried about?
Right. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as it exists now, came about as a result of his break first with ISIS and then with al-Qaeda. That much we know, and it's not because Jilani is some nice guy. He wanted to run his own show. He's a very ambitious person. He also realized that in order to win the war, it did not help him with the United States, with Turkey, with Israel, with Russia, to be seen as a transnational jihadist of the IS, that is Islamic State, al-Qaeda type. So his narrative is, look, this is a Syrian civil war. The Syrian people against an oppressive, corrupt regime run by Bashar al-Assad. By the way, his father, Hafez al-Assad, began this regime as a family concern in 1970, and it's a regime that has been dominated by the Alawites. It's a Shiite offshoot that comprises about 10 to 13% of the population. So that is Jolani's narrative, right? Now, Assad has his own narrative, and it was kind of echoed in what Tulsi Gabbard said. And it roughly goes like this. Look, you may not like me, but if I fall, mind you, what will come next is not some stable, peaceful Syria, but a free-for-all among various radical Islamist groups. They may be presenting themselves in a benign light now, but that is not really who they are. So there are two competing narratives here, one by the Assad regime and the other by Jolani and HTS.
And let's look at that aspect of it. So HTS is a group, even by his own accounting. Jilani said there on that CNN interview. There are others, and there are some that, like ISIS, that apparently are still antagonistic toward them. So even if they're able to move forward, what does that say about what these other, whether it's al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other new organizations? I'm sure there's probably quite a few. What would that say to the stability within Syria?
Entirely possible. At the moment, there's no question that HTS, along with the Syrian National Army, are driving this offensive against the Assad regime, right? And of the two, HTS is the most powerful. What happens in the event that they actually precipitate a regime collapse is another story entirely. I don't think al-Qaeda and ISIS are strong enough to become a major factor. One of the reasons, and you know this, that we are involved in Syria, in the northeast, in alliance with a group called the Syrian Democratic Front, which is largely Kurdish Syrian dominated, is that we have looked to the Kurds in the northeast in order to fight al-Qaeda and ISIS and have been reasonably successful. That's kind of left the field open for the likes of HTS. But your question is, do we know what happens after Assad falls, if he falls? We don't know. I should just say one other thing, Danny. The other difficulty for the rebels in taking Damascus, and I'm not saying they won't do it, but one difficulty is not only will they stretch their supply line south, but Damascus is really well defended. The 4th Armored Division, that is commanded by the president's brother, Maher al-Assad, is based there. On top of that, the Iranians and the Russians, despite their difficulties, and we can talk about this if you'd like in more detail, have lots of sunk cost there. And already Russian air power is in action. For Russians, the stakes are very high because in Latakia, on the coast of Syria, they have a naval base, Tartus, and an air base, Khamim, and their success in shoring up Assad from 2015 onward has been pointed to by Putin as evidence that Russia is not only a major power in the Middle East, but a global power. The Iranians, of course, have a great deal at stake with Assad because they've backed him for a very long time. And the supply lines to help Hezbollah also run through Syria. So the two of them have a lot at stake. So this is not over yet. It's at the moment not going in favor of Assad, but he's got two powerful groups in his corner. And as difficult as their situation may be, I don't think they're going to stand by and watch him fall without a fight.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I want to look at that broader dynamic here. I want to actually start off with Turkey because Erdogan made a comment earlier today, which almost seems contradictory within the context of just the one, pardon me, with just the one video here. Watch how he seems to be saying he's for the rebels at one point, but then maybe not so much on the second point. Roll that tape.
What we hope and pray is that this march hopefully will go on in Syria. Well, as this resistance goes on in the region with the participation of the terrorist organizations, if you remember, we made a call to Mr. Assad and we said that let's come together and let's discuss and let's shape the future of Syria altogether. And we couldn't receive a positive response from Mr. Assad to this call. But as you know, they have taken Idlib, Hama, and Humus is at the hands of the opposition forces, and they are heading forward to Damascus. So this march by the opposition forces in the region is not we desire, because the whole region is unfortunately in great instability.
So I thought it was odd, first of all, that he says, I've been working with Assad about issues with stability inside of Syria, and he didn't seem to want to play ball, as though the leader of one country should just say, yeah, sure, whatever you say from your country, we're going to do. So I'm not sure why he expected that. But the bottom line is, he said at first, I hope the march by the HTS South continues on. But then at the end, he's like, but then again, I don't want regional instability. What does Erdogan actually want?
Erdogan's first priority is the Northeast, where we, the United States, are allied with the group called the Syrian Democratic Forces. The largest element within that group is a Kurdish group called the YPG.
Garrett, can you bring that map up while he's talking, that big map we had on there a minute ago so people can see where this is? Yeah, there you go. So that purple area in the upper right hand, that's, I think, where the area where the U.S. is in that little red circle. But then also the Syrian Democratic Forces are mainly in that purple area.
It's the part, Danny, north of the Euphrates River that flows from Turkey into Syria, right? It cuts through Turkey as well as Syria. So we are aligned with the SDF, which is dominated by the Kurdish YPG, the People's Protection Forces, and our interest is in preventing the rebirth, if you will, of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in that region. Erdogan believes that the YPG is nothing but a partner of the PKK, the Kurdish Nationalist Party that has been fighting in Turkey's southeast to create an independent Kurdish state. So he views what is going on in northeast Syria as also a Kurdish secessionist movement that will join northeastern Syria with southeastern Turkey. So there is a weird, well, actually not so weird, confluence of interest between Erdogan and Assad.
And so we had Ian Brimmer was on a minute ago talking about the issue with Turkey, but also the broader context of Russia and Iran were also involved. Watch this.
The changing of the geopolitics has really given the upper hand of the hawks in Turkey to tell HTS, go for it. This is an opportunity, unique time to improve your position. Still, they're not fully backing the offensive. They're not backing it directly militarily, nor are they fully backing it diplomatically, as they did, for example, with the Free Syria Army, the FSA, with a number of cross-border operations in northern Syria in the past decade. Now, Russia has been humiliated on the ground. These Syrian troops in Aleppo folded and ran away immediately. The Russians have sacked senior soldiers in charge of operations on the ground. And it looks like they are preparing to send troops into Syria directly in the next 24 to 48 hours to shore up Assad.
Now, I have subsequently seen a report that apparently up to 15,000 additional Russian forces may be an emergency sent in there. One would imagine it's probably air forces. What do you make of what Russia's position is, and how invested is Russia? Well, let's look at them first in making sure Assad stands.
Russia is very deeply invested in it for the reasons that I mentioned, namely the airbase and the port in the west, but also if Assad falls, it will undo everything that Russia has achieved since 2015. Unlike Ian Bremmer, I don't think that Russia's major contribution, however, will be on the ground. As you know, they have some difficulties with sufficient forces even in Ukraine, but they have a great deal of air power, which they've used with devastating effect. The question is who will complement the Syrian army on the ground if they need help. Now, ordinarily, it will be pro-Iranian forces, but the Israelis for the past year have really been hammering them in Syria, and they are in a bad way. Iran has also been involved in direct confrontations with Israel, so it wants to be careful. There is one other group, though, that could enter the fray. There is an Iraqi Shiite militia called Hash el-Shabi, which consists of 60 or so separate groups. It is, on the one hand, a paramilitary force, but it's also linked to the Iraqi government. At the moment, all I know at least, is that they're massing along the border with Syria. If Assad really begins to start looking wobbly, will they enter the fray? They claim to have 120,000 fighters. More realistic numbers are 60,000 fighters. So there are a lot of shoes to drop, right? What will the Iranian reaction be? What will the Russian reaction be? Will they complement air power with substantial increased ground forces? Where will those ground forces come from? What about the Iraqi militias? So it looks bad for Assad. It may end badly for him, but there are some chapters of this still to be written.
Now, let's look at, you mentioned Israel. Israel, obviously, and all this stuff started. And first of all, let me ask your opinion on, was there any linkage between the two or any coordination after Israel had the ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon? So shortly after that was announced and went into effect, then this stuff kicked off. So let me just start there. First of all, do you think that there was any connection, either overtly or covertly, between Israel and the launch of HTS operation?
Not to my knowledge, but this much is clear. Since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent Israeli bombardment of and ground campaign in Gaza, which is continuing, Assad has kept the southern Syrian front, which is a northern Israeli front, quiet. Now, whether that's because of a deal that he cut with the Israelis, or whether it's not in his interest to have trouble on the Israeli front, we don't know. But that is a very striking, interesting thing. Now, as for Israel itself, there's no love lost between Assad and Israel. And certainly, because Assad is strongly connected with Iran, Israel would like Assad to be weaker. What is not clear is whether it would like an outright collapse of Assad because he is the devil they know. And once he collapses, will there be a mayhem where HTS turns out to be something other than what it's saying, and other Islamist groups sort of take root, and Israel faces on its north a kind of messy situation in which there are many radical Islamist groups in action. So it doesn't want that, clearly.
Yeah, that's the real problem for Israel. Not merely just the devil, but you don't know what would come on the other side of that. And as you say, Syria has kept itself off the table and has not caused Israel any problem. So, from a pragmatic position, it seems like they would be perfectly happy if the Assad regime continues on, because who knows what may follow in there on their necks. But
Right.
I do want to actually ask, before we let you go here, what's the latest situation with Israel? So they have now conducted this ceasefire with Hezbollah, which I guess it's kind of on and off, but it's largely seems to be holding. And then they set this 60-day timeline, which I think overlaps the Trump administration coming in by about like 5 or 6 days, something like that. So it seems like it was potentially a bridge to get into the next administration. What do you think Israel's plan is once the Trump administration comes into power?
Ideally, what this deal is supposed to do is to clear Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, put it north of the Litani River, and have the Lebanese army and UN peacekeepers patrol the area. The problem is we've seen this movie before and it didn't end well. That is to say, the Lebanese army and the international peacekeepers were not powerful enough to keep Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. So the question is, will they be able to do so this time? Do we have any reason to believe they will? Because if they cannot, this ceasefire will simply be a pause to a renewal of confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel. For the moment, Hezbollah probably wants a respite because it's really taken a pretty bad beating, but it will regroup. It is a Shiite movement that has deep roots in southern Lebanon and also parts of southern environs of Beirut. So it's not going to walk away from this fight.
And what about the situation in the Gaza Strip with Hamas, which is Israel said the ceasefire did not apply to them. They were continuing on with that operation. But I've seen increasing reports just in the last few days. And actually, I think you sent me one, maybe even last night, that Ben-Gvir is like saying a little more openly, hey, maybe we just depopulate the place and start sending in settlers. How realistically is that threat?
There's no question that on the far right, people like Ben-Gvir and the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich and others, that they would like to depopulate and annex not just Gaza, but in their most outlandish dreams, also the West Bank. Now, that may be a bridge too far for even the United States to cross, but there's no question that they are ideologically committed to this. How ideologically committed to that is Netanyahu, we don't know. The problem is that he's extremely dependent for his political survival on the hard right groups that are in the coalition, particularly Ben-Gvir's party and Smotrich's party. Danny, before we go, can I say a quick word about the Trump administration and the Kurds in Turkey? The Kurds' nightmare now is that Trump wants to get out of Syria, and he may do a deal with Turkey by saying, look, this area north of the Euphrates, where the United States has been involved in a partnership with the SDF, we'll hand that over to you, providing you can keep ISIS and Al Qaeda out. And that will be really bad for the Kurds because without American support, they may not be able to survive and would be vulnerable to the Turkish army. So they are now watching very, very carefully because they have a lot on the line.
Yeah, and I guess that remains to be seen. And finally, what do you think, based on the Trump picks for nominees at various ministry positions in the United States? To what extent do you think Trump will change American policies towards Israel? Will he modify? Will he rein back in Netanyahu? Because I think by the most kindest interpretation, the Biden administration was almost powerless, or at least largely powerless, to prevent Israel from doing whatever they wanted. How do you see the Trump administration dealing with Netanyahu?
Biden, as you know, has fulsomely supported Israel while president, but he has a long history of being one of the most pro-Israeli American politicians. Trump is heavily backed by people who have a very strong interest in unconditional support for Israel. I don't think that will change. As to Syria itself, though, There are two versions, and I don't know the answer, but I'll put them out for you because it remains to be seen for the future. One is that Trump is a guy who doesn't want the United States entangled in useless wars, and he'd like to get out of Syria. The best way for him to get out of Syria, in northeastern Syria, would be to do a deal with Erdogan, right? The problem, though, is within Trump's administration, there are people like Trump, right, who want to withdraw and do less and not get caught up in wars that they believe are not in the interest of the United States. But on the other hand, arch hawks like Marco Rubio, for example. So which will prevail in the battle for Trump's soul or Trump's mind, so to speak? We don't know yet.
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait and find out. But in the meantime, thanks for coming on today and helping us make sense out of a lot of this chaos we have to say. And a lot is unknown, and no one can predict anything that's happening right now. And we'll just have to wait and see how this thing transpires, even in the coming few days.
Thanks, Danny. My apologies, by the way, for the sound quality.
Well, I'm sure we'll get it fixed up, but we'd rather have that than miss out on you. So thank you very much for coming on. Thank you, guys. Be sure and like and subscribe on the way out. If you haven't done that forward, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.